Today we are voting on the nomination of William Emanuel to serve on the National Labor Relations Board. The NLRB may be one of the most important independent federal agencies that you've never heard of. They are responsible for protecting the lawful rights of workers to come together and bargain with their bosses for higher wages and better working conditions. You know, starting a union is not an easy task. Often it's a large corporation against its own employees. The money and the ability to threaten retaliation is heavily weighted on the corporate side. For more than a century, many corporations fought unions tooth and nail, hiring strikebreakers and union-busting thugs, and later on, union-busting lawyers. So, back in the 1930s, Congress established the NLRB to act as a referee and to keep the playing field level so that workers would have a chance to form a union if they wanted to. President Trump picked William Emanuel to fill a vacancy on the NLRB. Now, Mr. Emanuel has over 40 years of experience practicing labor and employment law. He's represented manufacturing companies, trade associations, logistics companies, hospitals, and dozens of other giant companies involved in labor disputes. He's represented big companies like Nissan, FedEx, Rite Aid, Safeway, and Uber, and that is an impressive resume. Just one problem with it. In his more than 4 decades of practice, he has never been on the side of the workers, not once. Every party to a dispute is entitled to legal representation, and Mr. Emanuel has every right to spend his career representing corporations. But a guy who has never even once represented workers should not serve on the NLRB, period. The NLRB is not the Department of Commerce. It is not the Chamber of Commerce. It is not there to help pump up big corporations. No. When Congress created the NLRB, it gave it a simple mission: encourage collective bargaining. An individual who has spent his career working for some of the country's most ruthless union-busting firms, fighting off union efforts at every turn, has absolutely no business at the helm of an agency whose job is to encourage collective bargaining. The deck is already stacked against hardworking Americans. For the last few decades, productivity has increased. Corporations and shareholders have gotten richer, but workers, they haven't shared in that growth. Hourly wages have been virtually flat for almost 35 years, and one reason for this is the decline of unions. The impact is everywhere. Inequality has risen in America. Why? According to the Economic Policy Institute, the decline in unions accounts for about 20 to 30% of the growth in income inequality over the past several decades. When unions decline, all workers are hurt. For the more than 40 million non-union men working in the private sector, the loss of unions over the past 30 years has been equivalent to an annual wage loss of about $109 billion. It is no wonder that American families are feeling squeezed. The decline of unions isn't an accident. It didn't happen on its own or is the unexpected byproduct of some other event. Nope. Large corporations have called on their Republican buddies in local, state, and federal government, and they have launched a quiet but deadly attack on unions. 28 states have passed laws banning the collection of union dues from workers that the unions represent. The only purpose of these laws is to starve the unions of resources that make it harder for workers to join together and to stand up for themselves. The Supreme Court hasn't been kind to unions either, effectively decimating the ability of home health care workers to join together in 2014. And now, with a Republican-appointed majority on the court, they are poised to deal the knockout blow to public sector unions later this term. And with the nomination of Mr. Emanuel, workers won't be able to count on the NLRB either. As a candidate, President Trump promised American workers that under a Trump presidency, quote, the American worker will finally have a president who will protect them and fight for them. He also promised to drain the swamp in Washington and fill his administration with those who would work for working Americans, not for donors and not for special interests. When President Trump nominated Mr. Emanuel to serve at the highest labor court in the land, he delivered another gut punch to working people. In fact, Mr. Emanuel is the dream nominee for the donors and special interests, trade associations for the companies that make their profits on the backs of low-wage workers immediately came out in support of his candidacy. The National Restaurant Association, the International Franchise Association, the National Retail Federation, the Retail Industry Leaders Association, the National Right to Work Committee, and the United States Chamber of Commerce applauded President Trump's pick with almost giddy enthusiasm and urged the Republican Senate to quickly confirm him to the board. And today, unless a few of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle decide to stand up for workers, they will get their wish. We all know that Washington works great for the trade association and their armies of lobbyists and lawyers, but it delivers one punch after another to the hardworking Americans who sent us to Washington to work for them. If Congress isn't going to stand up for workers, the very least we can do is give these workers a fighting chance to join together and to stand up for themselves. It's the NLRB's job to make sure that employees can join unions if they want to. That is the law. A man who has spent 40 years beating back workers' efforts to form unions has no business on the board. I urge my colleagues to join me in opposing his nomination.